Okay, we will be making our 4 soil sensors at this point. In this bag, which is labeled at the top for soil, we will have 4 of the actual soil sensors. So these will go into the soil and they'll measure how much moisture is between them to know if it's wet or dry. Should have 4 of these. Should have 4 of the aux male connectors. And so we have a little heat shrink with each connector, so 4 heat shrink as well. And then 4 of these long 10-foot wires that have 3 wires inside each of them. So for now, let's start with our soil sensor. Can open this up. And you can see they give us little holes that we're actually going to solder into that makes our life a little bit easier. And you can see they're labeled signal, ground, and VCC. Signal will be our white wire, ground will be our black wire, and VCC will be our red wire. And you can see there's 3 holes on the top, 3 holes on the bottom. We're just going to go ahead and solder to our 3 top holes. So first thing we're going to do is we're going to take one end of this wire that has already been stripped for us, and we're just going to go ahead and twist these pairs together a little bit to make this a little bit easier for us to work with. And there's probably way more wire stripped than what we're actually going to need, so we're going to cut a little bit of this excess off to start, and then we're going to cut more off to clean it once we solder. So let's go ahead and let's start with our signal wire, which will be the white one. So I'm going to fold back the other 2 wires to make it easier for me. I'm going to twist the white wire to get a nice single strand, and then I'm just going to go ahead and snip a little bit. So let's make sure we're wearing our safety glasses before we cut anything. And I have been poked in the eye before by something I cut without glasses on, so definitely make sure you're wearing those. So what we're going to do is we're just going to go ahead and from the back side or front side, I like to go in from the back side where we see this little resistor, and we're going to put this white wire in right through where it's labeled signal, SIG. You're going to push that through till the insulation's tight on the back. And then we're going to bring our soldering station a little bit closer. We're going to hold that in place. And I don't like to clip onto the actual parts that go in the soil because I don't want to corrode the electrodes, is what those are called. So I place it right on the red material. And then we're going to push that right to where the insulation is flush at the end. And then what we're going to do is we're going to grab our soldering iron, clean off the tip with our sponge. And then we're going to grab our solder. And just like when we were making our little LEDs, we're just going to solder these right to the edge. We don't need a whole lot of solder. These should be a little bit easier to do compared to the other sensors. And you can see I have that soldered in there, but I can still see through the hole a little bit, so I'm actually going to add just a little bit more solder. And I think that looks a little bit better. So now I'm going to do a quick little mechanical test. Pull. It's not coming out. That's good. I'm not yanking on it, but I'm just giving it a little tug. And you can see my insulation's pretty close to where that goes through the hole, so that's good. So now let's go ahead and do our ground wire, which will be our black one. So I twisted this up a little bit. Once again, I'm going to go ahead and just cut a little bit of that excess off so I have something a little easier to thread with. And I'm going to thread from the same side that I threaded from earlier. I'm going to push it through the middle one that's labeled G and D for ground. And I'm going to pull it until the insulation is very close. And I'm going to put it in my solder hands, or helping hands. And you notice when you put in your helping hands, your wire may kind of pull out a little bit. So I just make sure I pull back and so my insulation is flush. And then kind of bend it over a little bit to hold it in place. And I'm going to add a little bit of solder to that hole now for our ground wire. I have that hole filled. I'm going to go ahead and pull this off real fast, give it a little tug, and I see I'm pretty good. It's not coming anywhere. And once again, I have my insulation soldered pretty close to where the hole is, or the insulation flush where the hole is. I'm not soldering my insulation. And then last, we're going to do our red wire, which will be for VCC. That's going to be the wire that brings power from our microcontroller to the sensor itself so the sensor can operate. I'm going to twist that really nice and tight so I have a single piece I can use a thread through. Once again, I'm going to thread from the same side that I threaded the other two. I'm going to pull that through so that my insulation is flush against the sensor. And then I'm going to pull that to the side a little bit just to make it a little bit easier for it to stay in place. I'm going to clip that down. And I'm going to go ahead and solder the last one for VCC. Got wire solder on the hole, pull it off, give it just a little pull test. Looks like it's doing pretty well. So now the last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to come through here and I'm going to cut all of these extra pieces of copper off. And now you can see we have our 3 soldered ends. We have the wires there at the back side, and that'll be able to sit in the soil just like that. And we'll come through later and add some silicone to make sure that we can protect these solder bonds right here. So now we're ready for the back side that's going to go to our aux sensor. And if you've started with the DHT22 temperature humidity sensors, these are going to be very, very similar. We're going to actually use the same pattern. So let's go ahead and draw that out one more time. So let's go ahead and unscrew one of our aux sensors. Once again, you can see where we have this U feature on the bottom and then 2 prongs, one on the left and one on the right. So if we draw that out once again, we have our U feature on the bottom, a prong on the left, and a prong on the right. The prong on the left will be our white wire, which will also be the data wire. Prong on the bottom will be the red wire, VCC. And when I say prong on the bottom, I mean the U feature on the bottom. And on the right side, we're going to use our ground, which will be our black wire. Okay, so now that we remember what pens to put on, we're going to go ahead and put our housing on first. We're going to put the small side on first, the skinny side. And this is going to be a little tricky. Sometimes it's easier to twist your wires a little bit together just to slide through. Now we're going to put our heat shrink on. And then we're ready to go ahead and start soldering. So we're going to start with the red wire first. We're going to twist that through. You can cut yours a little bit shorter if yours is super long right now. And what we're going to do is we're going to put that one onto the tail piece, the center piece. And we're going to slide it from the inside to the outside. And we're going to pull it till our insulation is pretty close to the edge. We don't want our insulation to go past the edge. So try to get mine pretty flush, and I bend the wire over. And I'm going to connect this in my solder hands, and now we can solder that hole shut. So I start with heating up the outside shell first, and then I'm going to add a little bit of solder just to fill that hole. And take your time, you don't need a whole lot of solder. The longer the soldering on there, the hotter the aux cord is going to get. So if you're holding in there for a while, definitely let it cool down before you grab it with your hands. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut that excess copper off without cutting the casing off. Don't want to cut anything from the sensor itself. All right. Now we're going to go ahead and do our white wire for which is going to send the actual data. We're going to twist that nice and tight. And we're going to do our upper left prong when we're looking at it this way. So we're going to do this one right here. So we're going to thread it from the inside out. And this one's tricky. Make sure, if you really get it tight, make it threading it easier. Or pull it so the insulation goes right to the very edge. Twist it over. And then we put these on our soldering hands, and we're going to solder this hole shut now. Once again, apply a little heat first. Let it heat up a little bit, and then we'll add our solder. I got a dab of solder on there. Take this off. Do a quick little pull test to make sure we're good, which we are. So I'm going to cut that excess copper off now. Be sure that we're not cutting off our tab. And then we're ready to do our very last one, our black ground wire, which is going to go to the upper right tab. This one right here. And I'm going to get that to be a nice sharp point to thread. And then we're going to thread it from the inside out. Just like that. We're going to pull it till the insulation it goes to the edge. And then we're going to twist it over a little bit. And put that into our soldering hands. And then we're going to add a dab of solder to that hole. Heating up the outside shell. I'm adding some solder. Notice how it went everywhere except for the hole. So that means I need to heat this up a little bit more first. There we go. Take that off. We're going to cut that excess copper off. And what we're going to do now is we're going to pull all three of those wires in between the tail. And then we're going to pinch that shut with our hands. As we mentioned earlier, you can use your cutters for this, but you need to be very careful that you're not cutting any wires or yourself. And just very, very slowly use that to pinch this shut. Okay, so once we have all of our three wires finished and bundled together, now our next step can be to move the heat shrink up. And we're going to try to cover the heat shrink up all the way as far as we can. I accidentally used the wrong heat shrink. It's a little too small, but that'll be okay for right now. But you'll want to bring yours all the way up to as far up the metal as you can. And then we will go ahead and shrink that down using our soldering iron. We'll just rub the edges of it. I want to make sure you don't use the tip because we don't want to put any, in case it does melt, put any plastic on our tip. We want it to be on the base. That still gets really hot. We're going to go ahead and shrink down our heat shrink next to our insulation. Keep some moisture out. And then we'll also shrink it down near our actual connector. So once we've got this shrunken down, we'll put our soldering iron aside, and then we're going to go ahead and we're going to move our aux base piece up. We're going to go ahead and screw that in. And we now have our aux connector soldered. We have our soil sensor at the other side, and as we mentioned earlier, we'll cover this up with some silicone. Put this into the soil. And once the soil has been watered, it'll be able to detect the moisture. It'll send a signal to our aux sensor, which will then plug into our microcontroller. And then we will use this to let our system know when it needs to pump water on and off for the irrigation. Thank you.